Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Hewitt podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Thursday, the 25th of July here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up today, President Biden delivers his first speech since dropping his bid for a second term, saying it's time for younger voices. And cooling AI fever pushes the Nasdaq into a $1 trillion tailspin. Plus, Rachel Reeves says the UK is open for business as one former Bank of England policymaker warns of tax hikes to come. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. President Biden has delivered his first speech since ending his reelection campaign. He endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him. In an 11-minute Oval Office address, Biden framed his decision to drop out of the 2024 race as a bid to unify the nation under a new generation of leaders. Addressing voters, the president painted Democrats as defenders of vital institutions and the U.S.'s democratic principles.
I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices.
The speech comes as it was confirmed that delegates to the Democratic National Convention will now meet virtually within the next 2 weeks to confirm Kamala Harris as the nominee for president and her yet-to-be-named running mate. Meanwhile, NBC News says that Barack Obama plans to endorse Vice President Kamala Harris for president soon. They cited multiple sources. And as the Democrats coalesce around Harris, Donald Trump is pivoting to his new challenger for the presidency. In his first rally since President Biden dropped out, Trump attacked Harris on a host of issues that will appeal to Republican voters.
If you want socialist health care, nation-wrecking inflation, the death of American energy, and a lying radical left liberal San Francisco extremist as your commander-in-chief, then Kamala Harris is your candidate. She's the one for you.
Trump also used the rally to attack Democrats on abortion in a bid to neutralise what is being seen as a strong campaign issue for Harris and Democrats more broadly. Now to the stock story. Investors are cooling on AI-driven stocks, sparking a $1 trillion rout in the Nasdaq 100, spurred by questions about how long it takes for bets on technology to pay off. Nvidia, Broadcom, ARM and Tesla all saw stock declines. But Shelby McFadden, senior analyst at Motley Fool Asset Management, says that investors may not have enough information to make their minds up about the sector.
What's going to cause the sell-offs is the selling. The investors have to go ahead and make that decision that they have all of the information that they need to make this conclusion. And I think that we're just a little bit too early in earnings season, even in tech earnings, for the sort of mass of investors to say, you know what, we're done here.
Motley Fool's Shelby McFadden speaking there. The moves come 2 weeks after softer inflation readings prompted a rotation from tech to companies that are expected to benefit most from Fed interest rate cuts. Well, staying with tech stocks now, and Tesla shares are down after disappointing second quarter results. That's after a rally on the company earlier this year, also linked to AI speculation. Tesla shares themselves rose 85% between their low in April and a near-term peak in early July. However, weak numbers and production delays to the long-awaited robo-taxi saw the stock plunge 12% in US trading on Wednesday. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle says the drop is sector-wide.
On the surface, Tesla, they put up a little bit of a messy quarter. The same was true for Alphabet. But I think the real reason those stocks sold off, because they weren't so bad. We've had this big rally out of the April lows, so too far, too fast. And we see that with NVIDIA. They didn't do any news at all, put out any news. That stock down 7%, the biggest drag. Plus, when we connect it with some of the macro factors and we take a look at bonds, we have bonds rallying, we have the yen rallying. That tells you investors are seeking safety.
So that was Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle speaking there. Investors are also concerned about Tesla's core EV business versus cooling demand. Its automotive gross margin, excluding regulatory credits, fell by 14.6% in the second quarter. That's versus 16.4% in the first 3 months of the year. So that on Tesla this morning. Now, turning our attention to the UK, Chancellor Rachel Reeves is taking her pro-business pitch to the G20 in her first overseas trip. The woman in charge of Britain's economy is expected to urge business leaders to take another look at Britain. Bloomberg's James Walcock has more.
Labour has bet the house on growth, and now Rachel Reeves wants to convince global business they can find a new home in Britain. Her government hopes if it can attract private investment, it can avoid or mitigate deep spending cuts. But there are a few quick wins, something the Chancellor herself told Bloomberg last week in her first major broadcast interview in the job.
We're going to have to make difficult decisions. We need to fix the foundations before we can start rebuilding things in Britain. But unlike the previous government, I am going to be honest about the scale of the challenge. I'm going to level with people.
Many expect these tough times to be laid out in detail next week when Reeves publishes an audit of the previous government's finances. Michael Saunders, the former Bank of England chief economist, thinks the Chancellor will use the bad news to justify raising taxes on wealth to net the state an extra £25 billion. In London, James Walcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Thames Water bonds have been cut to junk by Moody's, triggering a new wave of headaches for Britain's largest water company. Bloomberg has learnt that the utility firm is asking the regulator for special lenience as the downgrade may break its licence agreement. Earlier this week, the Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, said that he wants to toughen up the regulator's stance after a series of pollution leaks.
I want to crack on and clean up the water as fast as we can by giving the regulator the power so that water bosses who are responsible for these unacceptable levels of illegal sewage pollution will face criminal charges. We're going to ban the payment of their multi-million-pound bonuses if they persist in behaving like this.
Steve Reed was responding to data showing UK sewage spills were at a 5-year high. Thames Water already faces potential fines for paying dividends to its parent company twice last year and for sewage spills at treatment works. Any fines will eat into its little remaining money, which is expected to run out in May next year without fresh investment. Let's discuss the top story then today. Of course, everything that's going on in the US presidential race and more. President Joe Biden framed his decision to drop out of the 2024 race as necessary for unity and to save democracy. Talked about new voices, fresh voices being needed in office. This as Donald Trump held a rally in North Carolina, heaping criticism on his new opponent, Kamala Harris. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint session of Congress. Well, joining me now to discuss is our senior editor, Bill Fairys. Good morning, Bill. Good to have you on the programme. What impact do you think that Joe Biden's Oval Office address will have?
Well, it was an interesting speech, 11 minutes long, and he really had, I think, two goals. One, as you mentioned, is to try to unify the party, to try to talk about why he withdrew from the race, and his view that democracy, it's been something he said all along, he views a democracy as being at stake in this election. And he also, frankly, made a pitch for, I think, his own legacy in historical terms. He mentioned a lot of, the icons of American political history, even all the way back to George Washington, saying that, they've always put country ahead of personal interests. And sort of defining his decision in that context as well. So it'll be a while before we know whether that historical view of Biden comes into shape. But his immediate focus was to really try to give some additional momentum to Kamala Harris and try to get more Americans, more Democrats excited about the election choice they face.
Yeah, absolutely. He tried to neutralise, didn't he, some of the Republican attack lines, for example, on foreign wars. And he also raised, I thought quite interesting, Supreme Court reform.
Yeah, so he did lay out a couple of the things that he says he will spend the last 6 months of his presidency focused on. He did say, as you mentioned, that the U.S. is not involved in any major conflict in the world, that he's the first president, and I think he said, over a century who can say that. I don't know how that will resonate given the conflicts the U.S. does have involvement in with Ukraine and the Middle East. But then he talked about Supreme Court reform, and that's something that's going to be a very difficult road for that, but it does have an appeal to the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is frustrated at really the kind of the Trump dominated Supreme Court at this point.
Yeah. Speaking of Trump, he held a rally in North Carolina saying that he defeated Joe Biden. So you sort of, split screen on this idea again. Kamala Harris, he really pivoted and had a lot of different attack lines against her. He talked about her being the worst vice president in history, a bad prosecutor, incompetent, that she would destroy the country. I mean, it was a long, long list of negatives. It sounded like a very typical Trump campaign.
Well, what we're seeing, from the Republicans, I mean, this has been a head-spinning week for everybody, but particularly Republicans who had focused on running against Joe Biden. They are definitely trying out different attack lines on Kamala Harris to see what sticks, what might be their most effective approach. You had Donald Trump calling her a, quote, radical, crazy person today. As you said, attacking her judicial history and even going after her on abortion, which was quite a surprise given that abortion and reproductive rights is something that is one of the key areas that Donald Trump is seen as potentially having a weakness in among voters, particularly female voters.
Yeah, that is interesting. So that on the rallies and the speeches. Meanwhile, in Congress, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech. He again stuck to his hard line on winning the war in Hamas. It was quite odd timing in some ways, wasn't it? Do you think this is going to be then this will be surely a big issue for the next US president?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot will depend on the status of the war in Gaza at the time the next president takes office in January 2025. But this was a very kind of politically loaded speech. It comes at a really controversial time in the U.S. It was planned before anyone had any idea that Joe Biden would be leaving the campaign, and Donald Trump will have survived an assassination attempt, of course. But it's still coming in the middle of the election. It was a no-holds-barred speech. Defending Israel's policies and saying if Israel could get more U.S. support faster, we will, quote, finish the job faster. So you had, to exemplify kind of the divisiveness, there were a number of Democrats who boycotted this speech, and you even had at least one holding up a small sign that said Netanyahu was a war criminal. So it's definitely going to have reverberations throughout this campaign and into the next presidency.
Yeah. Bill, thank you so much for being with me and discussing everything that's going on then in US politics and its importance on the world stage. Really appreciate your time. Senior Editor Bill Faries. Now to that tech rout then. Doubts about the promise from artificial intelligence really broke through yesterday. The Nasdaq dropped 3%. That meant a $1 trillion rout. Joining me now is Bloomberg's tech editor, Vlad Savov, to go through what happened. Vlad, why do you think that the doubts about tech and about AI, about which we've heard so much, have emerged now?
Well, there's a number of factors at play here. One is when you look at Google CEO, his comments after earnings said that all this investment that we're putting in now, which is tens of billions of dollars to acquire those highly sought after NVIDIA chips and build massive data centers for air processing, is going to take a long time. It was a bit of a sobering commentary there. Then you also had a report about OpenAI and the fact that it's likely going to lose as much as $5 billion. You do have a very high run rate for all of this AI development. And a lot of investors, also you have to bear in mind, when we talk about a tech rout, it is coming in the wake of a tech rally, which was very much driven by this fervor and enthusiasm about AI. So some of them presumably are going to be taking profits and saying there is a level of uncertainty here, which I don't need to play in. And that is really the case. It is true that AI at the moment is still more of a promise than a clear straight line from investment to monetization.
Yeah, absolutely. Who did it hurt most, though? And how much has that money rotated then into small cap stocks? Because we've noticed that rotation.
Well, here in Asia, I'm based in Hong Kong. One of the biggest hits was taken by SK Hynix, which is a little bit unfair because the company just reported very good earnings. It more than doubled revenue. It is the supplier of high bandwidth memory, without which any of those NVIDIA and AMD graphics chips that create the AI accelerators, they won't work. Hynix is the leader in this. The company couldn't have done it any better. It still took as much as an 8% hit on its share price because, as I say, the sentiment has really shifted. If you want to go into small stocks, you can still look at hardware suppliers. Some of those in Japan did not get hit as heavily because ultimately the chip making gear and equipment makers are still going to have a lot of orders. When you look at whether it is SK Hynix, whether it is the likes of TSMC, they still have plenty of orders on their books.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.